I think I'll go ahead and get started now. Thank you for joining me today, Valentine's Day. My name is Vala. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Small Demons. We're a startup that launched at Tools of Change in Frankfurt, and we're in beta right now. So this is my second O'Reilly event, and I'm looking forward to the presentation, especially the discussion. I'm going to try and get through the slides and demo relatively quickly, and then hopefully get into discussion quickly as well. So the title of my talk is a little bit strange for a publishing event. It doesn't exactly telegraph a clear message, but I'm hoping that by the time I'm done, you might remember these two words as a framework for thinking about new product development and new market development in publishing. It's the framework we used in coming up with Small Demons, and I think it's actually a toolkit that works very consistently for thinking about change. And since the topic of the conference is Tools of Change, I thought I would talk about a method that might work in creating new value. But before doing that, I wanted to just reflect on why I think this is important. So I've been in this space for a couple of years now. My background before this was in digital media. I was at Yahoo, did a lot of product development there. And in coming to know the publishing space from the inside as opposed to from a reader or consumer in the last couple of years, there are two themes that are so dominant in terms of change that they tend to absorb all discussion. And I think of them as tyrants to a degree. They are format and reading. It seems like there's so much effort and so much discussion going around talking about the shift from one format to another at a very macro level, print to digital, but then very tactical level, what that means. And then the difference between professionally published and self-published. And just a ton of discussion around format and a lot of investment around format as well. I think this is an extremely narrow area of change and a little bit myopic. Similar to that is the reading space. What reading looks like as you go from print to digital, digital-first reading experiences, if there are enough readers, where we're going to get more readers. It's a theme that, again, is so dominant that it tends to be like a black hole and absorb a lot of innovation and thinking and activity. And what I think happens, and what I see happening around me, is that there's a lot of fragmentation in these two areas. There's tons of competing formats, tons of different ways of reading, and a lot of competition for ever smaller pieces of a pie. So what I wanted to share was a way of thinking that might open up a different approach, something that could create new value in uncontested spaces. And if it sounds familiar from a book called Blue Ocean Strategy, it's actually a much older thought, and it comes from William James. William James wrote a great book at the turn of in the early 1900s, Varieties of Religious Experience. And he outlined his method for studying religion. And in approaching religion, he said he didn't want to look at the institutions of religion. He wanted to instead look at individuals and individual experiences. And specifically, he wanted to look at what he called pathological religious experiences, things that were considered extreme or perverse in some condition. And he thought by studying the extremes, he would come to a much better understanding of religion than he would if he looked at institutions. And to me, the corollary here is the institution is sort of format and reading. And everybody sort of knows what format and reading means and looks like. It's the known, it's the given. What we don't look at enough is the pathological, the extreme, and the perversions. So when we were thinking about starting our company, this is really what we thought about. I thought, I want to do something that caters to pathological obsession. And as you can imagine, when we're trying to raise money and I talk about pathological obsession, that sounds narrow to people, but it's actually, I think, quite big. And when you look at an industry through the lens of pathological obsession, exaggerations and perversions, all sorts of new things open up. So I wanted to take a few themes, show how looking at them helps us think about publishing in a new lens, and then show how actually looking at them is what led to us. And then I think this approach works, it can be repeated like clockwork for any industry, which is seeking to sort of break out of its established boundaries and do something new. So the three areas that I'm interested in looking at are characters, pathological obsession, what we would consider obsessions with characters, worlds, and spells. These are areas that are native to a type of book that is the type of book that we're interested in, which is narrative and storytelling. So it's not something that applies for every type of book, but within the world of narrative and within the world of storytelling, the role of characters, the role of settings, and the concept of being lost in a book, being lost in a story, are native elements. So if we take those native elements and we look at exaggerated versions of them, what does that tell us about where we might be able to create new value in the publishing world? So I'll just take them in order. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with costume play, or cosplay as it's called. Very popular phenomenon in Asia, increasingly popular in the rest of the world. It's where people, down to the last detail, dress up as characters from fictional worlds. Not exclusively fictional, but generally fictional. In many cases, they come from video games, but they also come from manga and comic books, and from television shows, from novels. And there's a lot of different motivations for this, but the typical behavior that is consistent across all the motivations is that you get into character. So the things that you and I read about, and the things that we like when we read about, and then we put down when we're done with the book, these people don't put down. They go and they become the characters. I'll get off the guns because it's a little violent for Valentine's Day, but you see the level of detail and the level of intricacy in the outfits, and it's a one-to-one relationship between the fictional and the lived. It would be, by most standards, perverse, exaggerated, and pathological. I'm sure outside of Halloween, nobody in this room probably does this on a regular basis, but there are loads of people who do this worldwide on a regular basis. So I used to look at this and think, there's something interesting here. People want to live out fictional life more than just one day of the year. Maybe there's something, sort of like file it away as maybe that's an area for inspiration. Next up, still within characters, is acting. So in acting, we all know that actors play roles, and it's very typical to take on to a very fine level of detail the character that you're playing, but it's very atypical to do what Christian Bale did in this 2004 movie, The Machinist, which is he lost 36% of his body weight to play the role. He lost 63 pounds to become this character. This is an extreme body alteration in order to assume a fictional role that goes way beyond what 90%, 95% of most actors out there would be willing to do. It was considered, dangerous for his health. He was advised against going as low as he did, but he did it. And if you know what Christian Bale looks like, this is not Christian Bale. This is Christian Bale changing the outward shape of his body to conform to the needs of a fictional character in an extreme fashion. So it's not that different than these folks here in the level of detail. And when you look at these two different areas, they're both character obsession. They're both core elements of stories and books, but they're done to a much more obsessive degree in these other mediums, and they're done so obsessively that they're rewarded. So in a couple of weeks, we have the Oscars, and we will have awards for Best Leading Man, Best Supporting Man, Best Leading Woman, Best Supporting Woman. There are awards for costume play. The obsession is ranked. Now, if we come back to books and stories, where most of these characters come from, they just sit there on the page for the most part, and nothing really happens with them. We read about them, we develop affinities towards them, and we wait for their next book to come out. But when we're done, they go back on the shelf, or they go back on the digital shelf, and not much else happens to them. But there are people in this world for whom the story continues, and it continues in a perverse, exaggerated fashion. So we find this extremely interesting, this idea of conforming the fictional to the real. The next area that I want to look at is settings, and I'm going to hop into a totally different medium. So since I've been as long as I can remember, I've been reading comic books. I remember my childhood. I grew up as a child of immigrants living in the East Coast. Didn't have a lot of outward real-world friends, but I had a ton of friends in the comic books. Batman, Superman, very good friends. I read hundreds of comics as a kid, and over the years they grew into thousands. And one thing if you're a comic book fan, is that comic book fans take the rules of their worlds, these fictional worlds, extremely seriously, the settings. In the comic book community, it's known as continuity. And what it means is that if somebody writes Batman as 6'2", 225 pounds, which I've known his weight just about all my life, and in a later book, Batman appears 6'1½", 215 pounds, you're pretty sure that's not the real Batman. And people rise up in arms over it. So the degree of detail is so exaggerated, and the fact that these characters have been around for decades and get passed from creator to creator, necessitating change, sort of contrasting with that need for continuity, that within the world of DC and Marvel Comics, they have these things called handbooks and who's who's. So this is the B characters, as you can see, starting with Aquaman, going through Blackhawk for DC Universe, and this is the B to C of Marvel, where if you go through these pages of these books, they will in every detail tell you about the real-world settings of fictional characters. So how tall is Green Lantern? What color eyes does Nightwing have? What is their marital status? What is their business affiliation? Are they a member of any associations? What cities do they live in? What powers do they have? What history are they? Are they the first Green Lantern, the second Green Lantern? It's an entire cosmology and an entire world that is completely consistent and completely fictional. And if you change any element of it, people rise up in arms. So we can write these people off as crazy. And every time I go into these stores, comic book stores and conventions, I'm sort of reminded that there's a huge degree of craziness. Or we can say that there is something about worlds and settings that is an ongoing area of passion for people. And then we come back to regular stories. I'll call those, areas where people are not so known for being obsessive. And something as simple as the world of Bret Easton Ellis, where there's a continuity across books. And something as extreme as the world of Harry Potter. There are shared universes and shared settings within books that remain, again, on the page. Maybe somebody has put together a Wikipedia page for it, or a map of the, for example, the map of the road trip in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. You'd be shocked. You cannot find the simple route that was driven in the most popular, if you call it philosophy book ever sold, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. You can't find the route anywhere. I can tell you every place that Batman has ever lived in great detail, but I can't tell you the road trip that these guys took anywhere online. So there's extreme passion for settings and worlds in one medium, kind of left untapped in the fiction and nonfiction world. This was a second area that to me was interesting. So the last area is the concept of magic. If you're into a story, you sort of get lost in it. You're very familiar with the idea of being swept away. And people say, when you hear Once Upon a Time, you're just ready for a story. You're hoping that it's a story that's good enough that you lose yourself in it. If you've had that experience, then you've actually had a relatively common experience. It's not exaggerated because it's shared by many people. And common experiences, getting lost in a book, they don't really tell you much. What you want to look at is perverse experiences. So this is a writer, Grant Morrison. He is a comic book writer, but he's also written screenplays, and he has a book out called Super Gods right now. He wrote a very popular series called The Invisibles many years ago, and he did a lot of interviews around it. He went through some health problems at the time, and he was doing tons of interviews about the writing process. And he said, when he was writing it, he thought of it as magic. There's a piece I edited out of here where he did a bungee cord jump to cast the spell, and in his mind, as he was writing, he was seeing the things he was writing happen in the real world. And he went from thinking that there was coincidence to actually believing that the words that he was putting on paper and somebody was drawing characters around and people like me were reading would influence the real world. So, again, you maybe and myself, we get lost in books. He thinks his books change the world. It's extreme, it's exaggerated, it's perverse. So if we take these three things together, we can think that there's just a lot of crazy people out there, and they take the fictional world far too seriously. Or maybe we can think that the fictional world and the real world are actually not as far apart as we think. Maybe there's some bleeding between the two of them. Maybe there's some untapped room to take that intense passion that these types of people have and bring it back to the everyday. And maybe the fictional world is slightly more real and the real world is slightly more fictional than we thought. So that's what I think. And that's the organizing principle for our company, is the concept of a storyverse. The idea that the world of stories is connected, that the elements in them deserve a life beyond the page, and that if you bring out those elements and make them easily accessible to people, the extreme things that you see happening in the other three sections that I talked about will become much more commonplace. And that's what we do. So mechanically what that means is we look at stories for elements in them that could be passion points, elements that people could obsess about. We categorize these into 3 top-level categories: people, places, and things. But within them, we look at a broad range of things that could be interesting. So, for example, there's a writer I love, James Salas. He has a series, a Lou Griffin series, detective fiction set in New Orleans. The main character loves blues music, jazz music, and bourbon. And he drinks bourbon he doesn't drink bourbon in a normal way. He drinks bourbon in an obsessive way. And if you want to connect to Lou Griffin, you connect to him through music and drinks. And if you see up there under things, we have music and movies, and we have food and drinks. There are other characters who have gun obsessions. There's a site called Internet Movie Firearm Database. It's every gun ever listed in a movie. We list guns in books for people who have interest in guns and books. We look at characters. We look at just about anything that we can get our hands on in a book that might be interesting to bring the obsessive world of detail closer to home. So what that looks like on the site, and this is, by the way, literally the thought process we went through before we started the company, was we looked at these crazy, extreme, perverse experiences and thought, this is much more interesting than what the format of a book is going to be and what a reading experience is going to look like, because reading is already awesome. And so this is Small Demons. If you've seen it before, my apologies for taking you through something you've seen before. If you haven't, I'll give you a quick overview and then switch to questions. We have a site where we index books, and the site is broken up into the people, places, and things inside of books. At the top, I swear I was talking about Say Anything last night. We show little previews of books. This is Sex, Drugs, and Cocoa Puffs by Chuck Klosterman. There's a reference to the classic scene in Say Anything. Also Sam and Diane. I love Sam and Diane. This is just a little preview area where we show books and the things inside of them. So the Hudson River being mentioned in Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close. And then as you scroll down the site, the homepage, we do take little topics that people might be interested in. Groucho, I thought I'd have some fun with it today and be a little bit more playful on the homepage. So this is Groucho Marx, and you can see all the books where Groucho Marx is mentioned that we have so far listed on the site, the context it appears in. But then this idea of getting into the world of something. So the Mambo Kings play Songs of Love. Great book, great music. If you wanted to get closer to the world of that book, this is every song mentioned in that book. So if you wanted to take that book and experience it outside of just the book, create a playlist, listen to the music, these are the songs. Similar thing, there's a book, Prime. It's got a lot of alcohol in it. And I don't think a book like this is just meant to be read. It's also meant to be sipped and possibly drunk and maybe slammed. And depending on your interest, these are all the drinks. And depending on the characters you find an affinity with, there's a range of things to be enjoyed here. Snow White I thought was interesting because Snow White, being a very popular character, is also a code name for projects at Apple. Mentioned in the Steve Jobs book, they called the project Snow White. It's interesting to see how popular references morph over time. And then in the Harry Bosch series, I love the Harry Bosch series by Michael Connelly. If you wanted to watch movies like Harry and read books like Harry, these are the books and movies that he's into. So you don't have to change your body and become like a chain-smoking, out-of-shape detective with failed doomed marriages, but you could just read the books that he's into and maybe get slightly closer to the character. So when we look at things at a book level, this is a book, Pillar of Fire. It's a part of a trilogy about the King era that we index for Martin Luther King Day. This is sort of taking that entire world and bringing it back. So all the people mentioned in the book, and you get the context that they appear in. All the locations mentioned in the book. All the music, movies, television shows, things that have been long forgotten, like FBI, TV show, books, periodicals. We do this sort of index for every book out there, the Steve Jobs book that we just looked at before, as a way of taking that world, that obsession with detail, and just mainstreaming it, making it accessible to people. So you don't have to lose 63 pounds and 36% of your body weight in order to get closer to a character. You can listen to the music they're into. You can check out the places that they go to. You can watch the movies that they're into. And you can also read the books that they read. This high fidelity that I use quite a bit, I thought maybe I would pop around and show some popular items. If you're a Jack Daniels drinker, you can come to our site and find out who else drinks Jack Daniels and who you might be similar to in the fictional world. If you like Zippos, you would be... I met somebody at If Book Then in Milan who owns 14 Zippos, the first one dating back to 1952. He works at Nielsen. He looks like a detective. I mean, the man has a physical appearance of a private detective and works in book data. If he had only known that the presence of 14 Zippos at home means that he bears strong affinity to detectives and criminals, he might have seen the subconscious patterns in his dress selection. The Glock, very popular gun. Doc Martens. Doc Martens are very characteristic of a certain type of female lead. They appear protagonist as well as villain. If you own Doc Martens in your closet and you had a Doc Marten phase, you may find that you have some affinities with characters out there. Harley Davidson, things that are already part of our world that cross across the fictional and the real. And all of this, for me, was inspired by looking at people who, going back to William James, people who have exaggerated, perverse interest in books and stories. So I'm going to pause at this point, but I just sort of wanted to wrap with saying that a couple things. If you have any exaggerated, perverse interest in books and stories, please check out our site. But I do think that this is actually a very repeatable process for creating new value. It's simply looking elsewhere, taking the elements that are at the core of what you do, whatever your business may be. In this case, I narrowed it down to stories and looked at the core elements of stories, and looking outside the traditional market space to see what people are doing with it in extreme fashion. And if you look long enough, you find all sorts of new things that you could develop. We have one product out of this. When we open up our API later in the spring, I anticipate there being tons of new instances off of this. But I think that it's just a very refreshing way to look at new product development and new market development that frees one from the glasses that we tend to wear when we look too long at the same thing. So that's me. Thank you. Questions? Yes?
You mentioned your API.
Yes.
Talk about what it's going to do, what it will allow.
In a general sense, I can tell you that we want to make as much of the data on the site open as possible. In a specific sense, I don't know quite yet. What we're doing right now is we're actually collecting use cases. I know some of the use cases. Providing location-based data, for example, stories that take place in a certain area, character-based information. But if you have specific things you might be interested in, you can just email me, val@smalldemons.com. We want to have a very robust API. Obviously, if you look at my interests, they're in blending what's in books with what's outside in the world. And I have this phrase that means a lot to me, doesn't mean a lot to a lot of other people, that the world contains the story. So the API is our way of getting the story out into the world. And the more requests for use cases we have, the better. Thank you.
When you're indexing a book, what's the balance between automation and manual curation?
So the question was, when we're indexing a book, what's the balance between automation and manual curation? At the beginning, it was 100% manual. We took about 600 books, recruited people off of Craigslist, gave them instructions as to what we were looking for, answered their questions when they had questions, and we came up with 600 Word documents that were the basis for our original data set that we used to build the taxonomy. Once we had the taxonomy straight, and that went through a lot of Word docs and Excel docs and just messy human stuff, we then shifted to an automated approach. So right now we take EPUBs from our publishing partners. I should mention also our publishing partners. We take EPUBs from our publishing partners, we run it through automated indexing process. That process generates a degree of accuracy in certain categories and a degree of noise in others. And then we have a very small team that is right now doing some error correcting, but we will be pushing that out to the site for people to be able to help us crowdsource. Yeah.
Could I ask what technology
Sure.
you use to do the index?
Yeah, so we actually use a company called Zamanta, their API, entity recognition API. And then on top of that, we map out against Wikipedia and Freebase for disambiguation and classification. But we have a worldview about the data that is not consistent with either of those sites, Freebase or Wikipedia. So we do a lot of reclassifying and massaging of the data to conform to a narrative worldview. Oh, sorry.
How do you make money?
Sure. So right now we're very early, and we've literally just implemented the very first ability to buy content off the site. But there's a lot of obvious product and merchandising opportunities in this. Movie playlists out of books, music playlists out of books. We think there's a ton of very simple affiliate and retail opportunities. Down the line, I think there's a sponsorship model very similar to IMDb for books that are being made into movies. We don't have that obviously implemented yet because we're early. But the path for us on the monetization front will be very sort of natural. It'll be experiencing the things in books and then whatever revenue share we can make for making that experience possible.
You envision a future where for product placement in books, there's a market for that?
I don't know. There may already be. I'm not sure. There's in some of the books we look at by authors, when you start to see the consistency of brands across books, you wonder. I don't know. It's not. I think there's just a level of character detail that is brand driven, that is just part of modern times these days. So I'm not sure at what point it becomes product placement. I haven't looked at it that way. We haven't seen it that way yet. I think in a great story you can tell the difference. But I don't know. It's a good question. Yes?
Do you think about sharing the analytics data with publishers to understand where the trends are that they can't see?
Sure. Yeah. So we part of our partnership is based on, one, sharing back the tags that we extract, and then two, usage data on the site. And then as we get more advanced and have more filters into the data, we would love to share more as well. Yeah. Yes?
How do you see yourself working with sites like LibraryThing, Goodreads, Shelf Party? Do you see synergies? Do you see competition?
Yeah. We've had, so I see synergies. We've had some requests from early users to be able to import lists and the like from those sites, so book lists and all that. I think those are all great sites. They are focused on something slightly different than what we're focused. So I think natural areas for us are more activity-oriented sites. Things like Foursquare, for example, where you're out in the world, and the ability to pair our data with geographic data, location data. That to me is more of a natural fit. I think it serves different purposes, and everybody can coexist sort of nicely. Yes.
Is there a social aspect to it? I was just thinking like the conjecture about if the brand's not represented, but what would the brand be, or something like that.
Yeah, so if there's a social component, yeah, we're actually working on the social bit right now for user-created lists, user favorites, and liking, and then also things like what you mentioned. One example is which characters that have not been made into films yet, who would play them, things like that. So we could do that across a number of areas. Yeah. Yes.
What about reference works or travel guides? I mean, you're basically deconstructing a book here. In some ways, and making it sort of API web accessible, right? So you kind of have a lot of categories that are in travel guides. Is this in part sort of, is it potentially maybe a travel guide of the future?
If you like to travel through the fictional world, for sure. If you like to travel through the story world, for sure. We could cross-index, and mapping and location is actually something pretty big for us. Whether or not we'll actually focus on reference books is TBD. We have a lot of narrative-based works to get through first, but I think integrating with those types of works to layer on this information would be fantastic. Yes.
So I think it's an easy opportunity for publishers to work with this type of information. You can see a great example of enriched media, the on-the-road book that was published last
Yep.
year. That has, it takes the text and puts it alongside interactive media, maps, multimedia, and the type of, I'm assuming the type of data that will be accessible through your API, if
Yeah, for sure. So the question was about sort of integrating with reading experience, correct? Yeah. We would love to do that, and that would be a use case for the API. It's something we haven't focused on because, as I started off with, I feel there's so many people focused on format right now, and a lot of good work being done in there that we really want to focus instead on data and amassing a large volume of data that can then be used in a variety of ways with existing people who are better, more focused on format. So yes. We get that request a lot. It's extremely fragmented, as you know, between the Kindle, Nook, iBooks, Google, and then a ton of startup readers. They all have sort of competing ways that you'd have to integrate the data for it to make sense. So we would love to do that at some point. Yeah, a lot of the books that you mentioned, like On the Road, they're one-offs. They're almost like apps. To be able to consistently do it across scale, you need one of those larger players to integrate. Sorry, there was... Yeah, go ahead.
Do you thoughts of extending to content? So, for example, you mentioned video games and things like that. Is it just going to be text-heavy right now, or
Our unit is stories, and we started with stories and books, but we're very open to looking at stories in other mediums once we get broad coverage in books. So movies, music, television shows, potentially video games. I have a huge passion for books, and I want to go pretty far in books before we get to other mediums. But the unit for us is narrative, and that obviously has different representations. Sorry, there was somebody... Yes?
How do you see this as being used for fictional worlds where you don't have the tie-ins with
Yeah. So how do we see it being used for fictional worlds? A couple ways. Those fictional worlds are often referenced in other books. So that's one way. Another is that those fictional worlds have consistent rules. So being able to navigate those worlds based on rules. A very simple example is, show me all the books where sunlight is fatal to a vampire versus all the books where it's not. Gathering up those rules is interesting to us. And then we have something called an inspired by relationship. So there's often times where you see something in a fictional world that was inspired by a real element, even though it's not the same. And we can track those as well. Was there... Yes? Sorry, there was a late... Whoa. Yes, ladies first. It is Valentine's Day. Yes. Yes. I'm sorry, I can't hear. Okay, so if we have any query language for querying multiple characteristics, for example, characters who like X, Y, and Z. Not yet, but we will. We have the data, we just don't have the ability to sort, on the front end, to sort by it. It's a huge, that's how I want to find things, and for the time being, I'm still the CEO, so we're definitely going to be doing that. Yes? Yes. Yeah, it's completely structured that way, yes. Sorry, there was a hand. Anyone else? I'm not sure how we are in time. We might have finished. Yes?
Have you given any thoughts to taking this down to a virtual world then? So essentially you're doing this creating augmented reality.
Mm-hmm.
In the physical world, but you could take this and sort of allow people to import it into the second language or something like that.
Yeah, if we've thought about virtual worlds, part of the whole contention is that the real world is already very fictional. And spending time, like, I'll give you a great example. I was at the W Union Square a few months ago for a meeting, and I was reading Spook Country by William Gibson. And there's a passage in the book where there's an escape scene that takes place, a chase, right through the same lobby that I was in. And I had the book with me at the time, but I was 20 pages away from that sequence. So it wasn't until I read that later that I realized that I was actually in a place that was laced with meaning, and laced with a very specific type of meaning and a specific type of adrenaline. And I had no idea. Now, when we have our API out there and we have this data out there, I will know, and my presence in that space will be completely different. It's sort of like, when you order a Vesper Martini and you hear Bond music in your head, you feel different. You have a different sort of body chemistry. And to me, that's a shame to shove into a virtual world. Yes. Go. Yes.
Do you have a way to accept self-published work? So you're indexing stuff that's already been published, but stuff that just otherwise might be under the radar.
Yeah. Right now, we're doing everything sort of at a publisher by publisher basis. So to get the first massive content up there, and then we're going to try and figure out ways of doing that for submitted books. Yeah. But we're trying to do major catalogs all at once to get up to scale.
Sure.
Yes.
Have you thought about doing something like listing, say, character types from TV tropes or anything like that, so that you could look through related plot structures?
Yeah, so if we've thought about doing things by character types, absolutely. There's a book, Zazie in the Metro. I don't know if you know this book. It's a certain type of child character. And I was in Milan for the If Book Then conference, and I met a woman who had launched a site based off of Zazie, named Zazie, because they wanted to capture the spirit of the child. I love character types and want to be able to navigate everything by character types. So child rebel, teenage rebel, man with failed multiple marriages, femme fatale. Yes, so we're collecting all those right now, but we don't have them on the front end. We don't have a way for you to navigate by it yet, but we will. Yes.
So how can publishers use your service or to push up the discoverability?
How can publishers use service to push up discoverability? So one thing is becoming partners with us. The way that it works is that we get a feed of EPUBs from publishers. We tag them and we return the data back. So the data could be used for all sorts of discoverability on internal sites and merchandising on corporate sites. And then also, obviously on the site itself, the books become tied to a broad range of interests that they wouldn't be tied to otherwise. So that's one of the core things that we try and do for our partners.
So the publisher really does push out and dump all the world on their site?
Well, we return the data back, and it could be used for merchandising, for example, if you want to put together every book that is set in a certain city as a merchandising category, or every book that features a certain type of music. Yep. I'm not sure when we were supposed to end, but if there are other questions, but if not, thank you. Great, thanks very much.